Hi, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. My name is Maria Duggan and I'm a British Academy postdoc at Newcastle University and the British School of Athens. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about imported ceramics in Western Britain. Hopefully I'll give you a little bit of an overview of my own research, things I've been involved with over the past decade, some of the developments, and hopefully this might have some relevance to some of the questions from the research framework, things like networks of contact and exchange, and some of the political relationships that result from these connections. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will work. So you might be familiar with some of this material, but I'm just going to give you a little go over the sort of material that we're looking at. And principally what we have are amphora, so transport vessels for wine or olive oil, dating to the 5th, 6th century, and particularly for the Mediterranean imports, we're looking at the later 5th century towards the first half of the 6th century, according to kind of more conventional dating. Principally what we have are late Roman 1 from the East Mediterranean, late Roman 2, which is the kind of standard late Roman Aegean amphora, and late Roman 3 in lesser quantities coming from Western Anatolia. And also we've had this B5 vessel, which has previously been seen as North African, but increasingly we think probably isn't. And I'll come back to this a little bit later on. Most of the information we have on dating comes from the fineware, and what we have in Britain is principally the late Roman C, Upper C and Red Slip, again coming from Western Anatolia. And what we have for Britain and Ireland is almost entirely, or is entirely, late Roman C formed 3. And this has formed the kind of core of the dating for the whole of these import systems. And you might notice here the late Roman C found at Dinas Powys, with the animals on. I think these were first described as leopards and then later on by Ewan Campbell as probably hares. But also there are African red slip vessels, and there's a range of forms here that can help to date the imports. I should mention that we don't have huge quantities of any of this material, perhaps a couple of hundred amphora, less than 100 fineware vessels, and although this is growing, it's certainly not large groups on a Mediterranean scale. And then after these Mediterranean imports, we have this sort of secondary phase of imports from the continent, the SPA, which is a grey fineware from the Bordeaux region. And then we also have E-ware, which again, we now think is probably coming from Bordeaux. And this is a slightly later date range and a kind of wider distribution across Western Britain and Ireland. And this is a courseware. The most recent comprehensive study of the imports in Western Britain done by Ewan Campbell, and here you can see his distribution map of amphorae showing them very marked concentration of these finds in southwest Britain, particularly Devon and Cornwall, but also in the region of the Bristol Channel, so South Wales, and also into Ireland and up Western Britain. But that very big black circle there is the assemblage from Tintagel. And Ewan, like others, drew a very clear link between the concentration of these finds in the southwest with the mineral resources from this region. So principally we're talking about tin, but also potentially lead and silver. And it's thought that the Mediterranean commodities were arriving in exchange for tin coming from this region. So my own PhD research was looking at the nature of this connection and particularly questioning this older model of direct shipment from the East Mediterranean, with ships sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar and straight to southwest Britain. And this direct shipment, this model suggesting some kind of direct connection with the Byzantine East Mediterranean. And principally, this idea was based on there being very few or no equivalent finds from the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. But Again, increasingly, this is seen not to be the case. And in fact, there are fairly large distributions of the same Mediterranean imports up the western coast of Spain and Portugal, here shown by late Roman C, the fineware, in this map by Paul Reynolds. And here's a distribution map from my thesis, showing that the British finds are very much the northern extent of an Atlantic distribution of these wares. That very large circle is from Vigo in Galicia, where Adolfo Fernandez has published very large quantities of the same material that we find in Britain. And in my thesis, I was attempting to suggest some of these networks of transshipment that were operating along the Atlantic seaboard between the 5th and 7th centuries, with perhaps ships arriving from the Mediterranean and with key ports like Vigo, but also Bordeaux, operating as transshipment ports for routes further to the north, with material like metals being amassed in the north and sort of shipped through these intermediate ports back towards the East Mediterranean. So here's Tintagel, which I'll be talking about slightly later, and Vigo and Bordeaux. So just to summarize some of these new findings coming from this Atlantic-wide research, you can see that the insular examples of these imports aren't unique, and I've suggested this indirect transport link with the East Mediterranean. And in fact, the British assemblage is fairly distinct from the West Mediterranean, but pretty well reflects patterns seen across these Atlantic sites. And we can connect all of this to an expansion of East Mediterranean trade into the Atlantic between the later 5th and middle 6th century, with some movement on either side of that. Mentioned Vigo probably operating as the main transshipment point. And overall, we seem to see that these Mediterranean imports decline from around the mid-6th century. In Atlantic regions of Spain and Portugal, perhaps we can connect these with a demand for tableware, and certainly we see quite large quantities of Mediterranean tablewares, fine wares import to this region. But perhaps further north is a suggestion that the quantities of amphora suggest a focus on wine imports instead. And perhaps most interestingly, this continental phase, we can see as the evolution of the very same system into the later 6th and 7th century, perhaps with a link towards Bordeaux as the primary transshipment point, with eWare and DSPA coming to the fore and being exported southwards as well as northwards. Last year, we published an edited volume from a symposium we had at Newcastle, where we brought together researchers from across this region, trying to piece together some of these Atlantic seaboard systems. And the whole idea is to try and start to study these imported materials from Britain in an Atlantic context. And we're also trying to use the same terminology. So rather than talking about ewares, we're talking about late Roman I, late Roman II amphora, just so we've got that consistency with Mediterranean research. What's quite clear from this kind of collaborative work is that there's an increasing range of types of material that are players sort of within this network of Atlantic exchange, and that there's a real complexity of exchange with changes over time. And we're also starting to pick out differences between zones in the Atlantic in terms of demand or consumption. Back in Britain, there's been developments in research. So the Bantham publication of 2011 published quite a large assemblage from southern Devon. But overall, the largest quantity of material is still the one from Tintagel in North Cornwall, mostly connected to research carried out at the site by Raleigh Radford and by Charles Thomas. And here you can see some of the finds from the visitor centre at Tintagel itself. You can see some of the late Roman amphora and fineware, as well as things like glass, which were also imported at the same time. There was a survey at the site in the mid-80s, which revealed extensive earthwork fortifications not fortifications, earthwork foundations across the site, which are connected to, potentially connected to sub-rectangular buildings. And in 2016, an excavation was started, led by Jackie Nowakowski, to investigate some of these earthworks on the southern terrace of the site, which hadn't been excavated previously. Here you can see one of the, a photo of the excavation here on the southern terrace. And very happily, I was asked to carry out the specialist analysis on the finds. So these are some of the excavated materials coming from 2017, so it doesn't show any of the 2016 materials. So you can see for Britain, this is a very large assemblage of finds. And I thought what I'd do is just show you some of the material. The actual analysis is ongoing and it's actually being written up at the minute. So I can just show you a few of the finds for now. So typically we have late Roman 1, late Roman 2 and late Roman 3, very much fitting with typical patterns from the British import sites. We also have some more unusual material, things like in the bottom left, this little handle, which seems to be from a juglet or a small jug, possibly coming from the Antioch region. And what I should say is this assemblage from Vigo is really giving us a sort of suite of possibilities of things that might be around in the Atlantic. The large sherd on the right there is from an amphora, possibly of the Agora M273 type, which is something we haven't had in Britain before, and again is possibly coming from the Aegean or from Western Anatolia, and seems to be connected to a kind of family of amphora of this type, which has been connected with the island of Samos, but might be being made in a couple of different places. So that's something we're investigating at the minute. Just to show you a little overview of the material coming from the Teacock excavations, 2010 sherds, which is giving us about an estimated total of 41 vessels, which is pretty high for, or is very high for Britain, and particularly has this high quantity of fineware, 18 vessels, mostly late Roman C fineware, with a typical focus of the later 5th, the first half of the 6th century. So far, 21 different amphora vessels, again with a focus on late Roman 1, late Roman 2, but as I've mentioned, a few new amphora types of interest. And notably, something I'll come back to, no E-ware coming from these excavations. And in fact, I can't see any E-ware from Tintagel at all yet, which is probably particularly relevant, perhaps in terms of chronology, but also in terms of the nature of the contacts with the site. So just to show you some of the nice fineware, late Roman C rim sherds. And this quantity of fineware is something that's really quite unusual in Britain. And I think that's something that we perhaps need to stress, that a lot of the import sites just have a few sherds of amphora and maybe the odd sherd of fineware. I think what we're seeing at Tintagel is a real demand for tablewares, potentially to be used in some kind of dining, maybe in a kind of Roman style, but also connected to practices going on in the Atlantic. So we maybe need to see it in a slightly different context to other sites, and maybe think about what the meaning is for the presence of those sherds at other sites. Are they indicative of contact with Tintagel, or important for showing kind of long distance connections rather than necessarily being used for dining in the same way? So these are all questions that need to be kind of developed. I was lucky enough to get funding for a British Academy postdoc, looking at the entire Tintagel ceramic assemblage, going right back to the early 20th century. So I won't say too much about this today, just to say that very much key to this is a collaboration with the British School at Athens, working together with Dr. Evangelia Kyriatsi from the Fitch Laboratory and Noemi Muller, who are helping me to carry out scientific characterization of the materials. So we've got 103 samples from the Tintagel collection, which I'm currently working on, trying to identify new material and look at sources for the amphoras and finewares. So I'm interested in looking at the sources for the more typical amphoras, things like late Roman 1 and 2 I've mentioned, but also some of the more unusual types and things that perhaps haven't been identified as of yet. So just to show you some of the thin sections of late Roman 1, and at the minute it seems like late Roman 1 and late Roman 2, the groups are fairly coherent, perhaps suggesting that they're coming from quite a similar source within those types. I mentioned this question of B5 amphora. This is a large amphora which has previously been connected to North Africa, but recently it's been suggested that typologically it can be connected with amphora from southern Spain. And recently they've had publication of amphorae dating to the first half of the 6th century coming from Huelva. And we can suggest that a lot of the material from this B5 group might actually be from southern Spain. So the petrological and scientific and chemical work on this is ongoing. But it may be that we can suggest a southern Iberian origin for a significant amount of this material. And I've mentioned that we also have other new types of amphora. So here in the top left, you can see a couple of amphora spikes from amphora, which we can connect with this Agora M273 Samosistan family, probably coming from the Aegean. So this is new for Britain, and this is something that we're looking to develop in terms of the project. You can see some comparable amphora coming from Butrint and also from the Cryptobalbi in Rome. So overall, we can see that there's a sort of broader range of origins for the material at Tintagel, including southern Spain, which is something new to consider, and also a wider range of types. And I was just sort of thinking about these more unusual types and having a look at the finds from Dinas Powys. And first of all, I was struck by just how different the material is from Tintagel. The presence of ewer is obviously something that's different, but also this focus on DSPA fineware, the presence of African red slip in equal quantities to late Roman C. Although we have African red slip at Tintagel, late Roman C is very much more common. The presence of, within this DSPA, a few vessels of Rigwar 29, this mortarium, although we have this at Tintagel, the quantity at Dinas Powys is a bit unusual. And together with the presence of late Roman 4 amphora coming from Gaza, or that kind of region, is something quite unusual. And it reminds me more of the sort of character of imports that we're seeing in southwest France, with the kind of prevalence of DSPA, obviously from that region, but also particularly late Roman 4, probably containing the best wine of that period. And also I was thinking about this, this amphora, unidentified amphora that Ewan Campbell published a reconstruction of. And I was speaking to a good friend of mine, Heraclea Diamanti, who works at the Ephorate of Cyclades in Greece. And she, like me, saw potential parallels with the late Roman 13 amphora, which is something that we haven't had in Britain before. And certainly I don't recognize this as being very much like the material that we have at most British sites. So it's possible that it's something that's just a bit unusual, or is it possible that this is a slightly later amphora? And that's something that hopefully we could follow up and maybe discuss a little bit more. So that's just a very short overview of some of the research that I've been involved with, but I'd be very happy to take any questions and speak a little bit more about some of these findings with you all. So thank you very much indeed for your time.